Zuck said something very interesting. He said, one heuristic to know whether you're saying something meaningful is that like reasonable people can disagree with it. And the opposite of it is also reasonable. So like move fast and break things could be like move slow and don't break anything. And that could be like a value at IBM, right?
Amjad, I am so excited for this. As I said, I've heard so many good things from Mazio for years. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. I'm a big fan of the show and excited to be here.
That is very, very kind. Now, normally we start with like, oh, the founding moment of the company, but you have a pretty awesome background that's not like, oh, I grew up in Silicon Valley and surprisingly I founded a startup. And so, such a surprise. But you actually grew up in Jordan. And so I wanted to ask, what were you like growing up as a child in Jordan? And how were those early years?
I was a big troublemaker. I looked very different. So I'm like a redhead. My family is actually sort of split right in the middle, where some of my uncles are, extremely dark complexions, and like a couple of parts of the family, like we're extremely like bright redhead. I'm actually like fairly, on the sort of not too intense sort of redhead, but we have like really intense sort of gingers in the family. But I look fairly different, and there isn't a lot of gingers in Jordan. And at the same time, I had a bit of a temper. I had a bit of, a little bit of a chip on my shoulder, sort of rebellious angle to me. And we grew up in my father was like this, he worked in government, and he didn't make a lot of money. He was an engineer, very kind of low level engineer in government. But he really put a lot of money behind our education. And so we went to school in a good part of town. And so coming from a bit of a, let's say, a challenging part of town where you sort of had to fight and you had to grind and hustle to kind of to just play and be just a kid. And then when we go to school, we're like a little bit odd ones out. And again, like I said, my appearance was a little different. And so I always got in trouble, like nonstop. Like since I was 6 years old, I would get in trouble for running away from school, or sort of inciting my whole class to do something strange or weird, or like. And so I was just seen as a sort of a troublemaker my entire childhood.
Can I ask a weird one? Did you
Yeah.
always know that you'd be successful? I think it's sometimes an innate feeling, sometimes it's not. Did you know that you'd be successful?
Yeah, because there was a lot of sort of early successes. So that situation we were in, my older brother and I, we found an arbitrage opportunity. The toys in the not so great part of town were actually much cheaper than the rich part of town where we went to school. And so we started selling toys at like very like preteen young age. My mother would come pick us up in this beat up old car, and we would stash the toys in the trunk. And so we would sell them. We would kind of tell people what we have during school because we couldn't carry the toys. And then we'd tell them meet us outside after school, and then we'd go to the trunk. My mom didn't know what we were doing, so we would sell these toys. And we also sold toys that weren't necessarily like most savory. So we sold like BB guns, and we sold all sorts of like, we did a lot of stuff like that early on to make money. And later on when I was a teenager, I also started my first software business. And so it just felt like I sort of had it in me. I had the hunger. I knew I was, I was bright. I did well in school even without trying. And so, I sort of knew that I wanted to do something great. I also was attracted to greatness. Like, I really loved watching movies and reading books about like great entrepreneurs, great athletes, great sort of history figures and leaders. And so I always wanted to do something great.
It's funny, whenever I, meet with founders, because obviously I invest for a living, I always say, like, tell me one, how you first made money. And I think it's a really important question, because you'd say, oh, I sold BB guns to kids at arbitrage prices, and it says a lot. Do you look for those early signs of exceptionalism when you hire people? And do you agree that when you see that, you're like, this person's different?
Yeah, I mean that's basically the biggest sign, is like the early sign of exceptionalism. I think it's fairly hard for people who has taken a normal straight path to life to do something exceptional later in life. I think there's always signs of exceptional things. Sometimes you'd have to dig for it, but I think it's always there, whether it's hustling and selling and starting businesses, incredible athletic ability and exceptional drive to achieve athletic things is also a sign. And so it can be very diverse, but it's always there, I think.
Sadly, I wasn't the athlete. I have to be honest. I could have lied and played that one out, but better to be honest early. I think my 100-meter record was about 48 seconds, which meant they lapped me on 100 meters. But I believe strongly that we're all a function of our histories, which means we're all running from something. What do you think you're running from, Amjad?
Mediocrity. I just hate the idea of being normal is just or normie, as we call it in internet culture, is like very scary to me. And undifferentiated is something that I really don't like to be.
I'm just gonna go straight into the advice section of this show. Fuck it, fuck the schedule. So I don't like dating today, because it's like the time that you spend on a date, it could be used so much better elsewhere. And I don't want to be that mediocre person, like going on a date when you could just be fucking crushing it. Like,
That's right.
how did you get over that? Because you have kids and a wonderful wife. Like,
Yeah.
how did you get over that, like, fear? And what would you advise me?
I think taking massive risk is the key. It's like if you really worried about mediocrity, then the best way to sort of run as far as possible from it is to do something so weird and so different that it's almost unthinkable. And so I guess in a dating scenario, I think you would sort of maybe you would not attract all the sort of like a vast majority of people would be actually turned off by this. But I think the people who would actually like you and would want to be with you for a long time and would actually match your sort of personality, you would attract them. And I'm actually a big fan of sort of being authentic and attracting allies and potentially repelling people you wouldn't like anyways, repelling them.
Well, I think you managed to do that with your personal brand. Don't worry, Amjad. You mentioned that kind of like the big risk taker. You said something before on Twitter that I thought was fascinating. You said great startups are examples of conspiracies to change the world. And I thought, God, that sounds great. What does he mean by that? So what do you mean by that?
I think if you read a bit of history, you find that most of history is actually built and changed by like a small number of people. I think we're actually living through a moment of history right now, especially given the AI revolution in tech. And you could argue that OpenAI is at the center of it, and it's really a small group of people. There are like 300 people now, and they were like much smaller before. They had a conspiracy, and their conspiracy was that if you get a lot of talented people together, that's what the original thing, and you work in really interesting AI research, you're going to find something. And then they found something, and most of the world wasn't paying attention to it, which is if you scale language models and if you keep scaling them up and put more computing data in them, you're going to find that it becomes more and more intelligent to the point that it's actually reaching some kind of general intelligence. Obviously not AGI as it's defined, but there's some generality in GPT-based models. So that was a conspiracy theory, and that was like that was like a small group of people with a secret planning for a long time. And so they were like conspiring as it were. And now they're at a point where they're changing the world. They obviously started this new arms race between some of the two of the biggest companies of the world. They birth a new sort of startup ecosystem. It's changing software as we speak. I'm sure we'll get into it later. But it's just a top of mind example. But you see it in history all the time. Like just one person starts it. Like obviously, like religion is a big part of it. Like, Jesus or Muhammad, you read their stories and they're typically small groups of people that fit in a room and they have some sort of secret or some sort of message, and they work really hard over many years, perhaps decades, and then eventually they succeed and they change the world. So I think startups tend to follow the same logic as these examples.
Do you think you're creating a religion with Replit? And how do you self-identify with those that want to create a religion versus those that just want to be in a hot company?
I think it's sort of in retrospect, you can sort of analyze these companies and say, I think it'd be like in the middle of it to be super intentional about creating a religion. It just comes off as cringe. I think maybe I'll let historians sort of decide that. But I think the main tenets is you sort of have somewhat of a, Peter Thiel calls it a secret, but somewhat of an insight into how the world works or how the world should work or where the world is headed. And so you work to advance that. One of our biggest insights at Replit is that software is a superpower, and this superpower is actually sort of stuck in this ivory tower of like Silicon Valley elite, and we're trying to free this superpower and get more and more people to experience it and make use of it. And we think that it's almost like at the time of the printing press, right? It was the people who could read and write were the priesthood, right? And then at some point everyone in the world started doing it, and that changed our world. And we think software kind of follows the same trajectory. So that's sort of our main insight.
I totally get you. And your main insight allows everyone to do stuff with software. And you tweeted before that the best job description is doing stuff. I find that we live in this generation of planners. They love meetings. They love taking notes. They love planning. Let's brainstorm. Fuck, why don't you just do something for once? I'm just venting now. So you said the best job description is do stuff. What did you mean by that? Just unpack that for me.
I said that outside of design and engineering, because in design and engineering, you actually can be somewhat specific about what people do. You can hire a machine learning engineer and they're going to be training neural networks, or you can hire a sort of drivetrain engineer at a car company, and they'll be working on that. So, but outside of that, I think, and even in engineering in some cases, people just need to be entrepreneurial and need to get stuff done, right? So at Replit, we actually have, maybe we're not known for that, but we have a very talented sort of business, legal, PM, biz ops teams. We're still a small team, but they're actually all very entrepreneurial and they're all just get stuff done. And so like, we get a lot done because they're behind the scenes instead of being the connective tissue of the company. They don't let any ball drop. You sort of like see them figure out anything and jump into anything and learn it. And as a CEO, I do that and try to exemplify that as well. And so
how do you get these traditional lethargic teams to do shit? Like, how do you create goals, structures, mechanisms to encourage proactivity?
Honestly, that's not the way to do it. The way to do it is more of a selection thing, like what we talked about, hiring exceptional people. You want to hire exceptionally entrepreneurial people. Like, there's no amount of processes you can put in to make someone who doesn't want to work hard to work hard. It's just
Do you think we're in a generation of people that don't want to work hard, that want kombucha, that want the yoga retreats, and that actually the savage mentality that I think probably me and you both have, for better or worse, is relatively lost on the majority?
Yes, and it is unfortunate, and I think it is the result of some decadence in the culture. I think there's a feeling that life is about sort of pleasure and sort of hedonistic pursuits, whereas I think sort of cultures of past, even 20th century America was very, very different, and the values of hard work and exceptionalism were there. And so I think it is a problem. And I think the way to find that problem, partly to inspire people, inspire younger generations that actually the value of making something is very important. And I think partly we need some kind of spiritual reform of sorts, because I think just like people need to understand that like pleasure is such like a fleeting thing, and that like that's not the thing that makes life meaningful. There's just like so much of it, consumption and just being passive. I'm not kind of saying that I'm gonna create that revolution, but I do think that a big part of like diagnosing what's like wrong with the world today is going to be about just like a lot of people are like super passive and not interested in doing anything interesting.
I totally agree with you. In terms of hiring for those that aren't, like avoiding those that aren't, I heard you have a non-values page from one of your trusty investors. What is a non-values page, Amjad, and how does that guide your thinking on who you hire?
Yeah, that's just one set of one page among like a set of things that we do to filter out people without like filtering out people is the hardest thing you could do in an interview process. And I'm a big believer in free markets, and so there are companies out there for every type of person to work at. But the type of person that we want Replit to work at is a very specific type of person. And so we do a lot of work to filter people who wouldn't be a fit out at the top of the process. And so we send people a lot of material, including like why not to work at Replit. We have a like entire blog post about that. Work here is hard. There's a lot of uncertainty. We haven't succeeded yet. All these things. We send them the non-values page, and even at the end of the process, we're typically selling people, but we're also like anti-selling them at the same time and just saying like like you shouldn't join if that's a problem or this other thing. Even our values page, we try to be somewhat provocative in the phrasing. For example,
how are you provocative in phrasing? Because I find everyone's like, we look for a team player who's good at communication and shared interests and alignment, and you're like, fuck off.
Yeah, I mean, Zuck said something very very interesting about like move fast and break things. I think a journalist was asking him about it, and he said like one heuristic to know whether you're saying something meaningful is that like reasonable people can disagree with it, and the opposite of it is also reasonable. So like move fast and break things could be like move slow and don't break anything, and that could be like a value at IBM, right? Or steady or slow, you can phrase it like a little more charitably. And so if something where the opposite of it doesn't make sense, or nobody would actually, it's not a value anyone would hold, then you're actually not saying anything. It cancels each other out. And so to be provocative, you need to say something that people will disagree with, and the opposite of is also somewhat reasonable. One of our values, for example, is like seek pain. And so the idea behind seek pain is that there's a lot of painful things in building a startup. Talking to customers is actually extremely painful. When your product is not working, or there's like some fundamental lack of product market fit, or some issue you're dealing with, founders and entrepreneurs typically don't want to face that. And facing that is painful. At Replit, we've had some things in the past that we weren't willing to face, for example, and that created a lot of problems down the line. And so I think most problems at companies are just delusions from not wanting to face pain. So to create a company that is like more in touch with reality, you have to create a company.
What do you tell yourself when you have a painful problem in front of you that you don't want to face? It's natural human intuition. Pain, you pull away. What do you tell yourself now then to engage with that pain and look to be proactive about it?
It's like a constant struggle. You just like make yourself, there's like a personal answer. Perhaps there's a team's answer, but like a personal answer is that I've tried to teach myself really deeply that, the cliche, no pain, no gain is absolutely true, right? Like every good thing in life is like comes from pain, and you work out that's pain in order to like live healthier and better, and like perhaps have a good body. Even things like the cold shower, they feel amazing afterwards, but you have to go through a bit of pain. A lot of the things that actually feel good in life in a really fundamental way have a period of pain that precedes them. And so there's a Pavlovian sort of aspect of this. So you want to condition yourself to really understand that pain often precedes good things. That's one way to go about it. And I think I just tell my team that the longer you delay like a painful sort of conclusion or decision, the more painful it becomes. You're just building a mountain of pain that you're gonna at some point have to subject yourself to.
I find as a leader, most of the pain actually comes from teams, like the people within your companies.
Yeah.
When you think about the pain that teams drive, have there been any core elements that really drive home for you? I think one of the biggest for me would be people who do not scale with roles, and it becomes very clear that they are not up to scratch for the new like size of company or new role.
That is extremely painful because especially people who's been with you since the start, you kind of want to have some loyalty towards them. And obviously they have loyalty towards you.
But do you? I push on that one. Do you?
Yeah.
They're not
But
up to
I mean,
scratch. They're not up to scratch.
no,
It's
I'm saying that's the natural instinct, right? But it's actually like, I think it comes from this tribal way of living that is in our DNA. But in a sort of like free market enterprise, it becomes somewhat deleterious and kind of really harms you. Because what you want to do is you want to sort of maximize the likelihood of success, maximize shareholder value, all these things. And so you're having empathy for the individual. You're not having empathy for the collective, for the rest of the company, for the company itself, for the customers, and for the investors. And so, you would need to reframe that in the mind in your mind as that, yes, I'm sort of like making this bad decision in order to signal some loyalty to this individual who's not working out, but I'm actually like harming a lot more people. So from sort of a utilitarian perspective, it's actually like a bad trade-off. And so, yeah, you have to do the right thing by the company ultimately, which is, either layer them, replace them, or do something else like that.
I heard from one of your investors, you were very creative in the way that you dealt with an employee that didn't scale. How did you deal with them in this situation?
Well, I typically try to find places for them in the company that they would be still happy. You obviously also want to make sure that they save face and like the change doesn't look like an obvious demotion. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes there are ways to find the intersection of where they would be happy and productive and where the org really needs to be. And so I don't claim to have like a magical solution here. It's like one of the toughest problems to do as you're scaling a startup. I think you can also be too hasty instead of letting that person go or replacing them. And instead, there are some ways to like find a place for them in the organization that would be happy for a longer period of time.
Amjad, what are the biggest mistakes you've made in hiring? Like mine is consistently, I think when you're young, it's easy to fall for logos and you look at people's CVs and go, yes, they've worked at Salesforce, they've worked at X, tick. I've done that a lot. When you think about your biggest hiring mistakes, what have they been?
It's actually the opposite. I sort of like give so much credence to the misfit that and we've had such a good luck with the misfit. Like the early days of Replit, I was the only like computer science grad, like up until like 10 12 people maybe. All the hackers at the company were like dropouts and English majors and poets and like all sorts of misfits that got into programming sort of semi-randomly.
And that was a mistake?
No. I'm not saying that's a mistake. I'm saying that my bias to the misfit sometimes it becomes pathological. I find misfits that I know are creative and good, but they have some personality flaw, and I try to make it work at the expense of other people on the team, right? And it ends up, wreaking some havoc sometimes. Maybe I stick with misfits too long and like really try to make them work. Because I like one of my, I would say like special abilities is to be able to manage misfits. But actually, like, it's not an ability that everyone can do, and they can have a negative effect on the company, even if they're creative. The usual sort of engineering manager adage, I'd rather have like a normal engineer who is a team player than like a sort of hostile, toxic engineer that's like a 10x engineer, right?
The misfit scale, it's a great culture to have early. You're 75 people now. When you're
Yeah.
400 people, 500 people, does the
Yeah.
misfit culture actually scale with process, with HR, with compliance, with approvals, with company-wide culture? Can you scale and still have misfits?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm dealing with that right now. So I can get back to you in a few years. I would love to think you can, like, you know, I think there's a way of doing that, but the history of companies show, like, Wozniak, was sort of like marginalized as Apple grew, and like he's like a total misfit, still is. But he stayed there for a long while. He was working on the Apple II, even when the Mac was the thing. Like, and he continued to contribute and things like that. So there are probably some ways of making it work. However, I will submit that you can't build a company made entirely of misfits that scale.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you there. Speaking of scaling, I want to talk about kind of scaling through time, because the world seems to be accelerating a little bit faster than ever, honestly, Amjad. And I think, I'd like to just focus on a little bit of context first, specifically related to like software development. How did making software get progressively easier over the last century? And by how much? Just set the scene in terms of developments, and by how much?
Yeah, so you go back to the early days of computing, and the way to program a computer was to directly interact with machine code. So that's literally zeros and ones, right? And then we had some ways of programming computers that were a little easier, like punch cards. You're still sort of typing in machine code, but it was a little easier. And then you had the biggest jump we had, which at the time, which was like probably a 10 to 100x improvement, which was assembly code. So now we think of assembly as like the lowest level code, right? But at the time, it was like their JavaScript of the time, right? Like, because you were able to create structure in your code, you're able to reason about it, you're able to share libraries between people. It just created the software industry as we know it, starting with the assembly and the assembler. But the assembly, you're still dealing with the physical hardware. You're thinking about registers, you're thinking about your CPU instructions, and you're sort of very close to the metal. And then you had the first innings of programming languages, and C was the first time you had. And again, now we think of C as low level, but at the time it was like the highest level thing. The sort of haughty assembly programmers would look down on C programmers like people look down now on like Python programmers, for example. But C was another 10x jump, because C, now you had the concept of subroutines and loops and code you can really reason about in the same way like a human kind of thinks. Whereas the assembly is like more like related to the machine. And so we're increasingly going away from sort of working on the machine, reasoning in the machine, towards something that more resembles a human narrative, and the way humans sort of think about abstract objects in the world. So C, I would say, and related languages, A, B, C, whatever, were another 10x improvement in productivity. And then the next big improvement was the scripting languages. So C was mostly like, it was like a typed language. You had to think about the types of the values and the objects you have in the system. But then you go from C to like something like Ruby, Python, JavaScript. That era that started in the late 90s was that actually, like, we want languages that are very flexible. You don't have to think about types. You don't have to design the entire program from scratch. You can just like start typing, and sort of like, it's almost like jazz or improv. Like, you're just like, you're thinking as you're typing and as you're coding. And arguably that was another 10x improvement. I think some people will probably argue with that a little bit. But then, we had a bit of a stagnant period for maybe 10, 15 years. The next 10x improvement wasn't a language. So up until now, we had all these 10x improvements that I think is like, multiple orders of magnitude, like let's say 1,000x improvement in productivity since then. The next one was not a language. I think we sort of tapped out on like how much languages could actually make you more productive. I guess that's TBD, but we haven't had a big language improvement since then. I would say the next era was open source and open source packages and sharing of packages. So pre GitHub era, pre open source, every programmer in the world had to write the same functions all the time. Like we're all writing the same sorting functions and the same sort of stuff. And now we had this way of sharing code, not just within companies, but just globally, right? And I would say that was another 10x, perhaps more, maybe 100x improvement in productivity. And so you had a college student like Zuck, build a site that reached billions of people because he used like PHP and MySQL and a bunch of libraries that were all written for him. He didn't have to write all that stuff. And actually, since then, I think it's kind of like we haven't had a big jump in productivity. My prediction is we are at the start of a new sort of S curve in productivity growth.
Why do you think we're at the new start now? I love Mark Andreessen's statement that there's no such thing as a bad idea, only the bad time. And it's like timing is everything I've learned in investing. Like,
Right.
Why is now the time? Because everyone always says now is the time. Why is now the time?
Well, I like we don't have to speculate, right? Like we actually can look at the results. Andrei Karpathy was the head of AI at Tesla, built the self-driving team there. He now, I think, back at OpenAI. A few months ago, he tweeted that AI is writing 80% of his code today. 80% of his code is written by a machine. That is unprecedented. On Replit, we see that 30 or 50 to 50% of code for Ghostwriter, our AI, Ghostwriter users, is written by the AI. The Ghostwriter users report that tasks sometimes are cut in half in terms of like how much time they needed. There was a study actually done on Copilot users, GitHub's Copilot, that showed that programmers are 55% more productive. So, okay, this is not a 10x, right? But it is a start of something. We're really at the early innings of this technology being large language models and transformer-based models. And so it's only been, 3 years.
Where do you think that is in 10 years? I saw a similar statement, which was GitHub's CEO said that 40% of their code today for the whole company was AI generated. Where is that in 10 years? And like, is there an increasing speed of development? Do you see what I mean? Like, is the cadence of development increasing with time?
So there are two ways in which large language models are going to change software. So one is the AI assisted development. GitHub Copilot is kind of leading in the space. I think we're like a fast follower. Perhaps we're going to exceed them in the future, but we are Replit Ghostwriter is another sort of AI assisted development. Actually, by the time the episode comes out, we would have come out with Ghostwriter Chat, which is, imagine ChatGPT that embedded in your code, knows everything about your code, can answer questions about your code, really starts to feel like another pair programmer human that's sitting there and helping you. So that's one track of ways that it's going to help us become better software developers. But there's another way which large language models can help us make better software and make more software. They are in themselves software. So every large language model is a function, essentially, right? You give it input, it takes output. And that function is programmable in English, what we call prompting. And you can make it do whatever you want it to do, right? So, crawling a website and scraping a website and getting useful information out of that is somewhat of a, we have a lot of libraries and ways of doing it, but it's still a difficult task. You have to write a parser. It's at least a many hours task, sometimes like many weeks. GPT-3 can extract any type of information, even in a structured fashion, from any website. That's how Bing search is written. That's how Neva, Perplexity, all the new search startups are done, right? And now, so instead of spending weeks writing a parser, you can just plug in a large language model that's trained to parse or that's prompted to parse. and you just saved hours of programming. So not only is it helping us program, it's actually replacing pieces of software, and it's going to become a core piece of software in the like function call graph of software, right?
You said it will allow programmers to operate at a higher level than mere code. This is kind of my question. When we reduce so much of the workload of programmers with the kind of automation in many respects, what do they do then? Like, what does a higher level mean?
So the higher level means is that you focus on the customer, right? I mean, it's kind of crazy to think, but most of programming today is really still trying to appease the machine. You're dealing with the issues with the libraries. You're writing library code. You're writing meta code in order to manage your workflow. You're fixing your environment, which is something we totally kind of fix at Replit. But the actual time spent on business logic is probably like maybe 15-20% of your day-to-day coding, which is absurd. So you take that 15-20% and that becomes the 100%, right? Maybe 95%.
Does it slim down your engineering team significantly?
Yes.
Yes,
but that doesn't mean software engineers go out of work. It just means that smaller software engineering companies will actually be able to have a lot more impact. But I think you would need way less engineers. Like you asked me about the 10-year prediction. Like I think like one person would be worth 100 engineers. One good engineer in 10 years would be as productive as 100 engineers today.
Why can the automation layer not solve business logic layer? Like if it solves, as you said, a lot of the kind of traditional infrastructure layer work, why can it not abstract itself one higher and go business logic?
Well, I think that's an AGI complete problem. And what AGI complete is basically you would need an AGI in order to do that. And so your prediction might be that AGI will be here in 10 years. Sam Altman in OpenAI thinks that, right? But then after that, the world changes, right, in a fundamental way. So it's called the singularity point because you can't really predict what happens after that. But ultimately, like if there's no AGI, and I think it's still a low chance that we're going to get AGI in 10 years, then business logic is fundamentally creative activity and fundamentally novel activity that it would be hard for a machine to entirely do that, because it would go out and have to understand customer needs and perspectives, and have to have like some way of having good judgment about the world. And it is like all these fuzzy things that we don't know how to program today.
Can I ask, I'm an economist, which is always dangerous. Never trust a VC who's an armchair economist. Terrible trait. But like, when you look at simple demand and supply theory, when you actually allow the world to create code, and when you create this excess within a developer time, you have an excess of supply.
Yeah.
Will we see the price and the real wages of developers go down as a result?
Probably. I think there are developers today that are commanding insane amount of salaries while actually working very little. And like it goes to what we talked about, like the value of hard work and all of that. The idea that you can like go coast at big tech and still be like a millionaire, I think it's absurd, and I think that will go away. I think that's just the effect of an inefficient market, right? And perhaps a zero interest rate market. But I think that was an unnatural thing that happened. And so in that regard, yes, maybe the average developer salary would go down. But I think the most creative, most hardworking developers will actually be able to earn a lot more.
Because you value their creativity? Like, why is that? Unpack that logic for me.
Because their leverage will be huge. John Carmack is one of the best software engineers in the world. He made Doom. He worked on VR, and now he's working on AI. He's still limited by how fast he types, right? Which is like a crazy thought, right? Like if he's not, because ultimately you have to type the code out, right? If the AI is actually better at typing the code out, and he's actually manipulating things at a higher level of abstraction, and he's talking to not just one or two, maybe 10, 100 AIs doing work for him, he's going to have an insanely higher leverage on the world. And so I think the best, most creative people will have a lot of the menial work automated for them. They wouldn't have to type a unit test anymore. The AI would do that, for example. And so a lot of their time is spent just doing more things. And think about Elon, right? Elon is like starting companies left and right, and that's probably not the end of it. Like he'll probably start more companies in the future, right? Part of the reason is because he's sort of like operating at a much higher level because he's built a set of very competent people around him. And like they follow him from one company to another, whether it's like on the finance and legal side or it's on the sort of like engineering side. A lot of that could be AI and could be automatable. So like we can see more Elon Musk type people that are software engineers because because once you abstract the kind of low level work, you can do more and more things. You can start more things and do more things.
When you look ahead, I see the green shoots, I see the creativity, I see the enablement. What does concern you?
Yeah. So wealth inequality will grow insanely a lot. And
how so?
Because like people look at Instagram or WhatsApp as these outlier companies that were able to achieve massive valuations with like very little people. And I don't think it's going to be an outlier in the future. I think we're going to see a lot of companies, 5-10 people that are going to have massive impact, probably be valued in the billions of dollars. And I think it's going to create a new crop of millionaires and billionaires in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. And these people are going to have more and more power in the world. And I think that will create more envy. I think humans will just continue to get richer, but I think wealth inequality is concerning, not because it means that some people are getting sort of the short end of it. Sometimes that happens, but I don't think it happens in technology. I think what happens is just creates more envy because people think they look at rich people and they think, oh, you must have robbed someone to get there. That's how politicians gonna frame it as well, right? And when you hear Elizabeth Warren and these kind of people talk about rich people, they talk about it as if they're like thieves, right?
Do you think you can continue to see such wealth inequality though? There is only so long before the mass populace will put up with seeing
Exactly.
someone with 250 billion. I think there is a case for the kind of storming of the gates.
Yeah. I think that I think rich people will get more and more hated, and I think it's going to create more division that way. I think politicians will sort of jump on that and will try to sort of gain from that, and maybe it will lead to violence. Obviously, I hope not, but maybe what you're saying, like storm the gate, like could actually literally quite happen, like people on the streets and all of that. So I think wealth inequality is something to worry about. That's for sure.
Do you not worry also about knowledge inequality? And what I mean by this is we talk about all of this. We can talk about ChatGPT as an infrastructure layer and the applications you can build on top and all of this, which actually is very base level knowledge, bluntly, in this space, as you know, but it's 99.9% higher than anyone else in society.
Well, I actually think that ChatGPT probably added multiple IQ points to a lot of people. So I actually think that AI is equalizer in terms of intelligence. And so, you have people who don't have access to the same education, and now you can have an AI tutor that is like everywhere and that works the same for everyone. And so I actually think that the knowledge gap will shrink, and the education gap will shrink, and even the intelligence gap will shrink. So all of those are good things, but nonetheless, I think the outcomes will be radically different, and that's just because like it's a free system, and free systems tend to follow power law nature. Like even in nature, anytime you see like a sort of free unrestricted system, you see like incredible inequalities, and so you basically have this problem where like the winner takes all, right? As you know, as a venture capitalist, like the power law is almost like a law of nature.
You mentioned kind of the demonization of these very powerful and successful figures. I'm intrigued. You tweeted the other day about Zuck and Zuck's priorities shifting from the metaverse to AI and the TikTok threat. What would you do if you were Zuck, and how do you think about this reshifting of priorities?
I think that's absolutely the right thing to do for Zuck. I think the metaverse bet is not like fundamentally misguided. I think it's pretty clear to me that at some point we're gonna have photorealistic technology, whatever it is, whether it's AR, VR, or what have you. Like you and I, it'd be great if you and I were actually sitting in the same room or seemingly sitting in the same room, right? That's like obviously true. But the like the I think they sort of underestimated maybe how much time it's going to take, and they probably overestimated how much free cash in the world there's going to be to continue to invest. On the other hand, AI absolutely clearly has traction and absolutely clearly has sort of happened. And so it would make total rational sense to kind of shift some resources to kind of invest more in AI.
Speaking of kind of investing more in AI, I think one concern that the US has is China and China's ability. I thought it was actually quite hilarious, bluntly, when you saw the shooting down of the Chinese balloon and that causing such controversy. And then you look at the App Store and see their 3 top placed consumer apps. And I'm like, well, they're sucking data from 320 million phones, but you're right, we should shoot down a balloon and be worried about it. My question to you is, how do you feel from a security standpoint about Chinese domination in US consumer apps?
Look, I mean, I moved to the US because I like sort of Western values of freedom and democracy and individualism. And I think the Chinese Communist Party embodies none of that. Like, it's pretty obvious they say it. They don't like individualism. And so they're clearly at odds with our values. But part of our values is free market and free competition. And so shutting them down just because we don't agree with them is also bad and corrosive to future investors and future sort of countries and players all over the world that want to invest in the US, right? So like we need evidence that they're actually doing something bad. But if we don't have that evidence, I would think it's government overreach to go and try to ban them.
Well, the evidence that they're doing something bad is actually just rooted in their company structuring, which is all Chinese companies have the right and what are required to share data with Chinese government upon request. That's like rooted.
Yeah.
In
Do we have actual evidence that data on U.S. citizens is actually like making it some way to the CCP?
That doesn't matter. They have the right to request it. If they have the right to request it, should we not have the right to ban it to prevent that right? Because otherwise we are at the will to wherever they say, yes, I want it, you're fucked.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a little conflicted on that because the Twitter files just showed that there's incredible U.S. government sort of collusion with U.S. social media companies as well. And so...
But at least the value alignment is there. Like you believe in individualism, you believe in meritocracy. Hopefully, do you see what I mean?
I see what you mean, certainly. But like, don't you think that we need to at least give some weight to the idea that we want our markets open to people, to foreigners to sort of compete in?
100%, but not if it goes back to a central governing body that fundamentally has disparate values to what makes us human.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, but there's like a lot of there's a lot of room. Like, if you were to make that law, like, how would you actually make it law? Like, what kind of value?
You would ban TikTok and you would ban Chinese apps,
right? You just single out China. Like, so what kind of what about Singapore? So Singapore is very much like top down and somewhat authoritarian, but they're a good ally of the US. People like to live there as well. Like, do you ban Singaporean apps?
Oh, I don't know the extent towards which Singapore have like views towards communism and
No, they're not communists, obviously, but they're like on the authoritarian scale. They're like way more authoritarian, right? So it's like defining those values clearly to make it into law. I think it's going to be tricky.
I agree with you. There's like a scale of like, well, how far is wrong? Just a little bit wrong, like, or very wrong. Right? So I get you that, but I don't like. Do you think TikTok will be banned?
Um, I think there's going to be increasing pressure on them to move more of their operations to the US. Obviously, they use Oracle data centers now. Maybe there's going to be more pressure to spring up more firewalls there. I think maybe there's more pressure for like more US based um, like companies. Maybe investors in the US have to own more of the company than ByteDance. Um, I think things like that will happen just with the increased pressure, and I think TikTok will have to become more transparent because right now they're like not very transparent. They use like every growth hack. It's like a very slimy app in that way. But I think they'll just have to react to the sort of public pressure on them, and I think they might be able to do a good job and sort of stave it off and give the U.S. government, U.S. people some assurances that they're not collecting data and sharing with the CCP, um, and I think maybe that would work out. Banning them outright, I don't see that happening unless there's like a full Republican government and like will of political will.
Yeah, no, I totally get you. I think you'd also have a million teenagers at least in outcry. Also, actually, to be fair, it powers a lot of people's like primary earnings now. Like, it is such a driver for both small business and individual creators that for the
Yeah.
US economy, I think there'd be a massive outcry in that way. I want to move into my favorite, which is a quick fire round, my friend. So I say a short statement, you give me your immediate thoughts. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, let's do it.
It's What are you most optimistic for when you look forward? We've spoken about concerns. What are you most optimistic for?
Equality of access. So, the ability for anyone in the world to participate in the software economy is just going to be huge.
How did having children change how you think and operate?
You become a lot more future oriented. You actually become worry a lot more about the world.
Do startups still do best when in SF?
Yes.
Why?
There's something in the air. I don't know what it is, but like there's just like this like optimism, this like feeling. I don't know what it is, but it is intangible. Some kind of community is important. I think New York has a lot more of it today. I think you can find it somewhere else, but community is important.
What's the one word that will be on your tombstone?
Man.
So, like, mine is persistent. Like, whatever it is, I just don't fucking give up. Ever. Ran an ultra marathon, broke my ankle. Fuck. That fucking hurt.
The thing that comes to mind is win, and I don't mean that I'm like consistently winning, but I consistently try to win, and I think it's a good value to have to like try to win, to win
If
as like a sort of a command.
if you could be CEO of one other company for a day, what would it be and why that company?
I would want to say a company that's like so different, just to like experience something so radically different. So like I don't know, like a freaking insurance company or something like that, just to like be able to know like what happens in parts of industry that I know nothing about. Um, yeah, like something super boring, like an insurance company.
Amjad, CEO of Pest Control Limited. We can make it happen, my friend. What do you believe that many disagree with?
I probably said a lot of things on this podcast that many will disagree with. Maybe the spiritual malaise, but that's like more in the ether today. I think Bitcoin is the future reserve currency of the world.
Okay, unpack that. Like,
Well, I think like if you play out the game theory of like how currencies have played out, reserve currencies have played out in the world. I think like the most neutral, like obviously like now a lot of people know that the problem with fiat currencies and just the problem with like creating money out of thin air, there's going to be some kind of return to a commodity pegged money. I think like you could return to gold, but gold has all these problems with it, like not being able to move it easily. And so I think the rational long term thing that will happen, and it might not happen in our lives, but ultimately humanity will discover that there's only one currency with all, or commodity with all the values we'd want for money, to create on top of it a lot of different national currencies, and that's going to be Bitcoin.
Amjad, if you could tell your 24-year-old self one thing, coming to the US with nothing but credit card debt, didn't sell enough of those BB guns, my friend. What would it be that you would tell yourself?
Not to sacrifice health and maybe friendship a lot. Like, I think I was so driven that I'm paying down a lot of sort of health debt and maybe reconnecting with friends now, and things like that. I'm like, knock on wood, totally healthy, but like there's some, some just, getting fit and getting back into like a good life habits, and all of that has been a lot of work. And so I've also neglected some relationships, and I don't know, it's almost like, that tweet recently by Mr. Wonderful, what's his name?
Yeah, no, I know exactly, on Shark Tank, where he said about like wife and dog.
Yeah, so like work, like be so dedicated to success that you could lose your wife and mother and dog, and something like that. And then after you achieve freedom, you can sort of like basically do whatever you want. There's some way to steel man his tweet. I mean, people got really angry at it, even people in Silicon Valley and entrepreneurs. But there's a way to steel man that, is that like you can actually take tremendous, in the same way you can take debt, tech debt, you can take tremendous amount of sort of life debt in order to be successful. And I've certainly took that. Now the question is like, could I've not taken that? Obviously nothing irreversible. I wish I'd spend a little more time with my mom before she passed away, but I don't know. Maybe I would tell myself to like take life a little bit more seriously.
I totally get you. The joys of hindsight. The final one, my friend. 2028, so 5 years time, say. Where's Replit then?
There's all sorts of ways you can answer that. Obviously, financial company, all of that. But I would focus on sort of impact. Like what I want is, I want like a kid in, rural Jordan to be able to have started a startup or successful business on Replit. I want like people anywhere in the world to like be able to come to Replit, teach themselves how to code, go do a few bounties and generate some income, and then start a startup and put it up in our app store community, and like start generating income from that, and maybe start growing it. And I really want that opportunity to be available for everyone in the world. So I want Replit to be a full stack service, from your like first line of code to your first app, to your first company, to your first dollar.
And listen, I've loved this. I've pushed you to the edges. I've been harder than I normally am. Normally I'm British and I'm like, whatever, just let it go. I'm like, nope, we're getting answers. Thank you so much for being so great, my friend. And I really enjoyed the chat.
Thank you. I appreciate it. This was, this was a lot of work, but I liked it.